Parthians, the Medes, and the Elamites. They were Persians. Today we would call them Iranians. Parthians were formerly a superpower of Persia, but here now they're just among the pilgrims. Out of all that were listed, the Parthians have traveled the furthest. The way that the book of Acts tells this story, it's like every one of these people who come in for the holy festival are like modern magi. They come in for a purpose, and then the expectation is that they'll head back home. Also, everyone in the story today is Jewish. Every Parthian arriving from far away, every Egyptian who has just crossed the Red Sea to get here, every one of them is Jewish in today's story. Ethnically different, but all gathered in place within the walls of Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Weeks is the harvest festival. It arrives 50 days after Passover. The citizens of Mesopotamia traveled Magi-style from modern-day Iraq, and they returned home after the festivities, one imagines. The Festival of Weeks celebrates the harvest, the first fruits of your labor, as it says in Exodus. And a fun fact for you, the Jewish people brewed beer just like many of their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. The beer was usually barley-based, which is to say that since this is a barley harvest festival, someone likely rolled out the barrel. The Festival of Weeks is the backdrop for this event, all these events of Pentecost. And it was predominantly a religious celebration. All the harvest festivals are. During the time spent together, two ritually important loaves of bread, 2 loaves of bread were prepared and made an offering. What made these loaves special is that they were made with leavened flour, which is unique among most all of the sacrificial bread used in worship. These loaves were allowed to rise, to bake, and then they were presented in the temple. And right there, that is, in a nutshell, is kind of what the Festival of Weeks is about. Because they come together to remember the Exodus. They remember the story of Hebrews living in bondage in Egypt. They did not have time to let the bread rise before God would lead them to freedom, and so their unleavened bread became a symbol. It was the symbol of Exodus's Exodus. Exodus is remembered now in the breaking of a very different kind of bread. And here we are, 2 loaves, the festival in miniature. The people come from all over Jerusalem. The Festival of Weeks. The Festival of Weeks is one of 3 pilgrimage festivals. The faithful come from places far, from near. They come to remember. They come to see and remember what it was like when they could not even let the bread rise. And now those days are over. 2 big, yeasty, puffy, spongy loaves are baked. Baked from barley not given to slaves who have no time to waste, but barley harvested on land that has been promised. And there's no rush anymore. There's no rush. There's plenty of time now for the festival to let the dough rise. In fact, that's kind of the point. The book of Acts makes sure to tell us that there are 15 nationalities gathered there to experience the miracle of Pentecost. 15 people in groups, whatever, in town for the festival. 15 nationalities hear the word of God. 15 nations, but upwards of at least 20 different languages, 20 different native tongues among them. So best as I can find, friends, the Parthian, the Medes, and the Elamites from Persia could all understand each other, basically, as long as they spoke Aramaic. But Aramaic would not have been a given, since every one of those places had their own language, because the folks from Parthia would speak Parthian, and the folks from Media would speak Median, and the folks from Elamite spoke Elamite, and no surprises there, right? The citizens of Mesopotamia could more or less speak to the Persian folks, since Mesopotamia spoke Aramaic, but only a kind of Aramaic. Theirs was what's called Eastern Aramaic, very formal, very administrative, very to whom it may concern. But the Persians could probably make out what the Mesopotamians were saying in the same way that when you turn on the TV and watch PBS, you're more or less sure you know what they're talking about in Downton Abbey, mostly. The Judeans, next on the list, lived in the area. Of course, they were the locals, and there among them you could find those who spoke Greek and who spoke Hebrew and who spoke a different kind of Aramaic, Western Aramaic. There were some who spoke Greek, nothing else. There were some who only spoke Western Aramaic. Jesus speaks Aramaic. Among the Judeans, there also were pockets of people who only spoke Hebrew, resisting the foreign influence. They spoke Hebrew and only Hebrew, and they would be just about the only ones, though, since outside of the Judea, Hebrew was reserved almost exclusively for the synagogue. So, here we are. The Judeans could speak with the Mesopotamians, just like the Mesopotamians could speak with the Persians, but at this point, it kind of gets all together, and you can imagine a scenario where a cabbie named Vinny from New York City, who says, forget about it, right, is having a conversation with a dowager countess of Grantham, Violet Crowley. What is a weekend? And they, the cabbie, the dowager, right, are in a conversation with Foghorn Leghorn. The cartoon Southern trope. So then you've got Cappadocians and Pontians and Phrygians and Pamphylians and these catch-all people called Asians, and they all come to Jerusalem from Asia Minor, and every one of those folks would be called Turkish today. And like their Persian siblings, some of them spoke a native language, all their own, of course, but ever since Alexander the Great came through town, Greek was the vernacular. And so I want you to try to get your head around this. So imagine with me the contingent traveling south from Asia Minor, and the road is long and their feet are weary, and so all these people find themselves staying at the same Hampton Inn. Now, the smart money would be that in the morning, when they all descended upon the breakfast buffet, they would all be speaking Greek. Why? Well, it's so then that the Pontians can tell the Cappadocians, hands off, that's my waffle, in the waffle maker. And sure, right, some of them spoke a more formal kind of Greek, and some of them spoke a more casual kind of Greek, which is Koine Greek, which our New Testament was written in. But they would be able to sort out whose was whose and whose waffles was whose and the like. Then you have fancy Egyptians, of course, and they spoke Greek if they had government connections, and again, they have so ever since Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. Less fancy Egyptians, though, who still believed, had their faith, no real connections, they spoke something called Demotic. Have you ever heard of Demotic? Demotic is the everyday language of Egypt. It's a cursive form of hieroglyphics. And I'll tell you, it sounds like nothing else on this list. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, was actually the product of Egyptian Jews. It was a big task, translating the Old Testament into Greek, because Egyptian Jews, or really any of the faithful on our list, they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. Greek is what they knew. And for that reason then, Greek is what they knew. They could speak most of the folks in Judea. They could make out what the crowd from Asia Minor was saying. They knew what the folks from Cyrene were saying, even if the Cyrenians, who came from modern-day Libya, had a thick Berber accent. And of course, for sure, to avoid all these international incidents at the metaphorical breakfast buffet, there were the Cretans, who come from Crete, although I've been called a Cretan before. These are the only people who are actually from Greece. Greek was so popular and common everywhere that you can add the Romans to the Greek-speaking world, and the Romans are the polygots of this Pentecost. They probably could hold their own with the Persians and the Mesopotamians and their different forms of Aramaic. They could hear and speak with everybody else's heavily accented Greek. They could, but not the Arabs. The Arabs are, in some ways, the odd men out. Have you ever turned to the Discovery Channel or seen any screensaver almost anywhere, and you see that carved-in building that's called Petra? Petra. Although you certainly are a figure. And This is from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you remember, right? Those are what's called the people who actually did that are the Nabatean Arabs, and that's who we find at Pentecost. But the Nabatean Arabs spoke what became the origins of the Arabic we know today. But we might imagine that, like everybody else in Acts, if they were traders, if they were travelers, if they were upper crust, then they probably also spoke Greek. 15 nationalities, over 20 languages between them. So many more, mind-numbingly more if you figure in regional dialects, but also the influence of geography and profession and culture, how it has on the spoken world. And if you don't know what I mean, think about how John Wayne has been in over 80 Westerns during his time in the movies, all of them in English. Also all in English were every version of Treasure Island and the Pirates of the Caribbean, also in English. But can you imagine a scenario when Long John Silver would know anything Rooster Cogburn was talking about when he said, "Get along, little doggies"? Here we are, Pentecost friends. Everyone hears the gospel. And on Pentecost, everyone is surprised. Luke records their surprise, but their amazement, their astonishment is not what it seems, friends. The crowd is recorded asking a series of questions. And it seems now they all understand each other. First they ask, "Are not all of these who are speaking Galileans?" It seems benign, but it's not. The people are less amazed. These travelers are less amazed and astonished at the languages. They're more shocked on who the languages are coming out of. Galileans are your stereotypical country folk. They were thought to be less educated, less refined. In fact, someone once asks of Jesus, "Can anything good come out of Galilee?" The crowd then follows up with asking, "What does this mean?" Which is not a Holy Spirit question immediately. They're wondering how it is that these people, how it is that they are, how it is that the Galileans are doing what stereotypically everyone thought would be impossible for them. The crowd wants to know, legitimately, are they drunk? Because at least then they could begin to understand what's happening. Friends, we're not drunk, but little seems to have changed. The crowds aren't 15 different nationalities, but together they represent countless backgrounds, countless ways of understanding the world, countless experiences shaping their lives. The crowds are not one faith either, sometimes not even any faith. We cannot assume that the crowds that gather today would carry any single universal set of guiding principles, any single universal way of living in the world, or even one single shred of value and respect for the church that wants to share it. And because little seems to ever change, it's those very same crowds that hear the very same gospel, that hear of Christ's love and Christ's grace in the language that Luke calls native, and the result, friends, is still the same. The result is the crowds gathered around are still left wondering what all of this means. They're so shocked, are the crowds these days, that anything good, they wonder, anything real, anything true, anything other than hypocrisy can come out of the proverbial Galilee, can come out of the church. They also want to ask, are not all these people who are speaking Galileans? You know, you could trust a Gallup poll or your gut feeling. Will both tell us that the proverbial crowds are shocked. They're shocked that the church can speak to them in their native mother tongue. They're shocked that the church speaks to them in their language rather than requiring that the crowds speak in theirs. When Peter rises to answer the crowd, it's to give them the answer they've been searching for. The people want to know what it means. They want to know what it means that these stereotypical, out-of-touch, behind-the-times, superstitious Galileans, how can they speak this way? They want to know how it is that these folks have reached them, how they've spoken to them, how they've caught their attention, but this time in a good way, since it's increasingly rare that when you turn on the TV or read an article and it talks about the church, that it's something good. The Pentecost crowd of today, friends, is asking the same very questions. They want to know, how can this be? How can it be that here and now the church has something to say? How can what the church is saying reach into the lives of others? How is it they want to know how the church has learned to speak their native language? When they ask, Peter tells them. He doesn't try to refute the stereotype that we're not hypocrites, or that we're not sometimes out of touch, or that we're not any of those things. He doesn't try to explain what he doesn't understand. Instead, he tells the crowd that Pentecost is the dream of the church. Friends, Pentecost is what it looks like when the church dreams. Peter quotes the prophet Joel. He tells in Joel's words what Peter sees happening there in Jerusalem. He says that sons and daughters are speaking the truth, and they're seeing a brighter vision than before, and the dreamers are dreaming dreams. Friends, Pentecost dreams are the dreams of the church. They're dreams of being empowered to reach out. They're dreams of truly communicating, to being able to truly connect with others. They're dreams of being understood and understanding. The Pentecost dreams are the dreams of the church. It's the dream of saying that all are always welcome, and the one who's been unwelcome everywhere, anywhere, also feels welcome here. Pentecost dreams are saying that our church is friendly, and then having the perpetually shunned or lonely or despised find relationship, find friends here. Pentecost dreams are not about what the church gets, but they're dreams about what the church can give. When we dream of speaking a language that's heard and understood by the hurting and the hungry, the afraid and the afflicted, the despised and the discriminated. Not so that we can get something out of them, but so that we can give something to them, what we have. The dream of Pentecost, friends, is being heard. The dream of Pentecost is connecting. It's being understood across boundaries. It's valuing differences and the differences that make us who we are, and still being able to speak of love and grace into the lives of the world. And friends, we are still dreaming these dreams. The dreams of Pentecost are to speak to one another, to be with one another, to connect with one another. By the Spirit, we are still dreaming.